It was a muggy evening in late October 1991, the kind of night when the air feels thick with moisture, and everything seems to hover just on the edge of something strange. The rain had started around dusk, soft at first, but steadily building into a steady downpour by the time I made my way into Manchuck Swamp, deep in the heart of Louisiana. They said the swamp was cursed, of course. Everyone who lived near it had their own version of the story. Some talked about it casually, others with wide eyes, like they were afraid the swamp itself might hear them. I had always been skeptical, brushing off the tales of ghosts, whispers in the trees, and the old legends that told of a curse placed by the Choctaw tribe centuries ago. Still, as I stood there, the rain drenching me to the bone, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling crawling under my skin. Maybe it was the cold or the scent of decaying wood and damp earth in the air, or maybe it was the eerie quiet that settled over the swamp when the storm hit. You see, the weather always changes when you get near the heart of the swamp, unnaturally so. It was around 9:30 p.m. when the first shadow moved across my path. At least, I think it was a shadow. I could have sworn I saw something dart behind a cluster of twisted cypress trees. But when I turned my head, there was nothing there. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the storm. The air was thick with the sound of rain, the occasional creak of branches swaying under the weight of water, and the distant croak of frogs. I wasn't alone, though. No, I could feel it. It wasn't just the wind. A few weeks later, I found an old photograph tucked behind some books in a dusty antique store, an image of a house I swore I'd seen in the swamp, though I'd never told anyone about it. The photo had that same eerie green tint I remembered from the night in the swamp, the trees twisted in the background, and a figure standing in front of a house that was half sunken into the ground. People in the nearby town of Thibodaux had told me about the man who had disappeared there in 1978, disappeared without a trace, just like the others before him. They didn't like talking about it much, but when they did, their voices would drop to a whisper. They said the man's name was Thomas, and they said he had been warned about the swamp before he went. Some say it was the curse. Others just say he got lost, but none of them could explain why he was found 2 weeks later, still alive but changed. His mind wasn't right after that. The whole place felt wrong that night. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few seconds, as if I was being watched. It wasn't until I heard the soft, almost imperceptible whisper of a voice coming from somewhere in the mist that I began to doubt myself. It was a woman's voice, low and melodic, calling my name. Jessica, Jessica. I froze. I wasn't alone, and whatever it wasn't friendly. But when I looked around, I saw nothing. No one. Just the mist, creeping along the ground like it was alive. Was it a ghost? Maybe. I still can't explain it. But the feeling that something followed me home that night, that something dark and ancient was still watching me, it lingered for months. I could feel it in my bones. I had to tell myself over and over it was just the swamp, just the wind and rain playing tricks on me. But a part of me still isn't so sure. Every time I walk through the woods now, that same cold chill creeps over me. Sometimes I swear I hear my name, too. I tried to shake off the strange feeling, telling myself that it was nothing more than the damp, oppressive air of the swamp playing tricks on my mind. After all, I had a reputation to uphold in the small town of Thibodaux, one that didn't involve talking about ghosts or curses. But the whispers never stopped. They came and went, faint at first, like a breeze rustling through the trees. Then, just when I thought I had it under control, they became louder, more insistent. It was late November by then, the air colder and the rain heavier. A few days after my last trip to the swamp, I began noticing things that didn't make sense. Small things at first. A door left ajar when I was sure I'd closed it. A faint shadow moving in the corner of my vision. The faint scent of something rotten when the wind would change. I convinced myself it was the house settling, that maybe the old wood was just creaking under the weight of the storm. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more the feeling of being watched intensified. One evening, a week before Thanksgiving, I ventured back to the swamp. I told myself I was just going to gather some information, take a few pictures of the area to make my article more complete. But as I walked deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. The sky was overcast, the clouds heavy with an impending storm. The temperature dropped, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw the silhouette of a man standing between the trees. My heart stopped. He was still, his figure almost blending into the dark foliage. I blinked, and he was gone. I hesitated. There was something familiar about the figure, something I couldn't place. It wasn't until I checked the photos I'd taken later that night that I saw it, the faint outline of a house, barely visible in the background, peeking out from behind the trees. But that wasn't the most unsettling part. The house had been gone for years. It had burned down in the early 1900s, or so the town history books said. But there it was, in the photo, just like I remembered it from the night of the storm, its roof charred, windows shattered, its door swinging open as if inviting me in. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept tossing and turning, haunted by the image of the house in the photo, the shadow of the man, and the whispers that had become louder and clearer. They weren't just calling my name anymore. They were calling me to the swamp. "Come back," they whispered. "Come back, and you'll understand." The next morning, I went to the town library, desperate for answers. The librarian, an older woman named Mrs. Broussard, gave me a knowing look when I mentioned the swamp. "You should leave it alone," she warned. "It doesn't forget. Whatever happened there, it doesn't let go." Her voice dropped to a whisper, as if she were afraid the swamp itself might hear her. She told me about the legend of the swamp, the story of a man named Thomas LaRue, who had vanished in 1978, just like the others. But there was something else, she said, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "They say the swamp isn't just cursed. They say it keeps a piece of everyone who enters, a piece of their soul, if you will. And once it has you, it doesn't let go. It waits, it watches until it's ready." I didn't want to believe her, but there was something in her eyes that made me think twice. It was the same look I had seen in the eyes of others who had disappeared. The same vacant, hollow stare. I went home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something just outside of my line of sight, always lurking. It wasn't until a few days later, when I woke up with a strange mark on my neck, a faint, almost imperceptible bruise shaped like a handprint, that I began to wonder if Mrs. Broussard's warnings were more than just stories. The whispers continued. The photo of the house continued to haunt me. But there was something more, something darker. I had to go back. There was no escaping it. But this time I wasn't just curious. I had to know what the swamp wanted, what it was trying to tell me. And I had to find out why it was so obsessed with me. That evening, under a darkening sky, I made my way back to Manchuck Swamp. The rain was falling harder now, and the air was thick with the smell of wet earth. The path seemed to shift beneath my feet as I walked deeper into the swamp, as if the land itself was alive, guiding me. But then I stopped. It was the photo. The house was there again this time, standing in front of me, impossibly real. And standing in the doorway was Thomas LaRue. His eyes met mine, the same vacant, hollow stare. And then, with a voice that wasn't quite his, he whispered, "You shouldn't have come back. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story." The moment his eyes met mine, I felt the world around me shift. The trees groaned under the weight of the swamp's heavy breath, the air thick with an energy I couldn't explain. I froze. Thomas LaRue stood there in the doorway of the charred house, his form barely discernible in the dim light, yet unmistakably present. It was as if the swamp itself had birthed him from the fog. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask him what he meant, but the words wouldn't come. The silence between us stretched out, longer than it should have. It was suffocating. Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, Thomas turned and disappeared inside the house. The door creaked shut behind him, but the moment the sound echoed through the swamp, it was as though the entire world held its breath. I wanted to run. I wanted to turn around and never look back, but something rooted me in place. It was a compulsion, something primal, like the swamp was calling me to follow, urging me to step into the unknown. Against every instinct, I moved forward. The house felt wrong. The closer I got, the more the air seemed to shimmer around it, bending and warping, as though it wasn't quite real. The ground beneath my feet seemed to undulate, and I felt a pull in my chest, as though the swamp was sucking me in, slowly but surely. But I couldn't stop now, not when I was so close to unraveling the truth. I reached the front door and hesitated. My heart was pounding in my ears. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave, to turn away before it was too late. But there was something else, the irresistible pull of curiosity, of needing to know what lay beyond. I grabbed the handle, cold and damp under my fingers, and pushed the door open. The inside of the house was dark, cloaked in shadows that seemed to twist and dance on their own. The floor creaked under my weight, and the musty scent of decay hit me in waves. As I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me in the silence of the house. I turned, half expecting to see Thomas standing there, but there was no sign of him, just the thick darkness that seemed to swallow everything whole. I reached for my flashlight, but when the beam cut through the darkness, I froze. The walls were lined with old photographs, tattered, yellowed, and faded, some of them barely recognizable. And among them I saw it, the same photo from the antique store, the one with the house I thought was long gone. But there was something different now. In the background of the photo, a figure stood by the window. It wasn't Thomas this time. It was me, my face, pale and contorted with fear, staring back at me. My breath caught in my throat. I stumbled backward, the flashlight falling from my hand, its beam spinning wildly as it hit the floor. I couldn't make sense of it. Couldn't. Just then, I heard it, a soft creaking above me, followed by the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, dragging like they were burdened by something heavy. My heart raced as I looked up, the flashlight barely illuminating the staircase that led to the second floor. That's when I saw it, the shadow of a person at the top of the stairs, barely visible against the darkness. I knew I had to leave. There was no doubt in my mind anymore. But my feet wouldn't move. It was as if I was paralyzed, my body betraying me, urging me to go deeper. The footsteps grew louder, each one echoing through the empty house. The air around me thickened, and for a split second, I swore I saw a figure standing just beyond the stairs, its face obscured, but its presence unmistakable. The outline of a woman, tall and thin, her long hair hanging limp over her shoulders. I wanted to scream, but the words died in my throat. I could feel the weight of her stare, even though I couldn't see her eyes. I took a step back, and that's when I noticed the faint trail of wet footprints leading from the stairs to the doorway of a room just off to the side. They were fresh, the wetness gleaming in the dim light like someone had just walked through. Couldn't resist. I had to know what was in there. Slowly, cautiously, I approached the door. My hand hovered over the handle, shaking violently, but I forced myself to turn it. The door creaked open, revealing a room that looked more like a time capsule than anything else, a place frozen in time, filled with old furniture covered in sheets, a faded rug in the center of the room. But in the far corner, there was a small wooden chest, and on top of it something else. A photograph. My photograph. But it was different now. I was younger in the picture, barely a teenager, but I could see the same haunted look in my eyes. And behind me, in the shadowy background, I saw the same house, the same twisted trees, and the woman. She was standing just behind me, her face now fully visible, her eyes wide open and full of something I couldn't quite name. Horror, anger, maybe both. And her mouth, though open, was silent, screaming something I couldn't hear. I reached for the photo, and as my fingers brushed the edges, the room seemed to lurch, as if the very walls were closing in. The temperature dropped sharply, and the shadows in the corners seemed to move alive, restless. I heard a voice then, cold and distant, whispering in my ear, but when I turned, there was nothing there. "Leave now," it said, "before you become one of them." It was the woman, and I understood now. The swamp wasn't just cursed. It wasn't just haunted. It was hungry, and it was waiting for me, waiting for all of us. The voice echoed in my ears, but I couldn't move. It was as if the words had taken root inside me, weighing me down, forcing me to listen. "Leave now, before you become one of them." But the way the woman's warning had been delivered, it wasn't just a plea. It was a command. And something deep inside me, some primal instinct, knew I couldn't leave without understanding what she meant. I had already crossed a threshold, and the swamp would never let me go until I knew the truth. I took a shaky breath and stepped closer to the photograph on the chest, my hands trembling as I pulled it from its frame. The instant the photo left its resting place, the room seemed to shudder, a low, rumbling sound filling the air, like the house itself was reacting to my touch. I could feel the energy in the room change darker, heavier. The shadows at the edges of the room seemed to pulse, as though they were alive, watching me. And for the briefest of moments, I swore I saw the woman move just a flicker, just a hint of motion, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. My head spun and my pulse quickened. Something was wrong, but I couldn't make sense of it. As I held the photograph, I felt a strange connection to it, like I was being pulled into it. The house, the swamp, it was all beginning to converge in a way I hadn't expected. The woman, the photograph, the voice, they weren't just fragments of the past. They were all pieces of something much larger. I turned the photo over, desperate to find some clue, some explanation. There, scrawled in faded ink, was a name, Lucille LaRue. The name sent a jolt through me. Lucille was Thomas's wife, or at least, that's what the townsfolk said. They claimed she had disappeared the same night Thomas vanished, though the details were always hazy. Some people said she had gone mad after her husband's disappearance. Others swore she had become part of the swamp itself, her spirit trapped, wandering forever. But none of the stories ever mentioned a photo like this. A photo where Lucille's eyes followed you, even after the picture was turned face down. I was about to put the photo down when I noticed something else, something that hadn't been there before. A crack, faint at first, but widening, running across the chest beneath my fingers. It wasn't the wood splitting. It was something else. Something darker, like a thin, black mist creeping out from within. I took a step back, heart pounding. The air was thick, and the shadows around me stretched impossibly long. The mist, it was spreading from the chest, crawling along the floor like a living thing. It wasn't just in the room anymore. I could feel it on my skin, creeping up my legs, curling around my wrists, pulling at me. The room spun, and for a moment, I felt as if I were falling, sinking into something deeper, something far older. The walls began to ripple, distorting like the surface of water disturbed by something beneath it. I heard a sound, a low, guttural growl, like something vast and hungry, trapped under layers of earth. My mind was racing, trying to grasp the enormity of what was happening. The swamp wasn't just haunted by spirits. It was alive, feeding on memories, on souls. It had been waiting for me to come back, to open the chest, to make the connection. And then, a voice different this time, a low, insistent whisper filled the room. Not in my ears, but in my mind. Lucille. The name reverberated, as though the house itself was speaking it. I felt an overwhelming pull, like the room was sinking deeper, pulling me under the weight of its history. I looked around wildly, trying to find the source, but there was no one there. No Lucille. Only the mist, swirling around my ankles, the shadows stretching towards me like arms reaching from the depths. And that's when I saw her. Lucille. She stood in the doorway, her silhouette barely visible against the dim light, her hair hanging in front of her face, her body twisted at unnatural angles. She was standing there, motionless, just like the photograph. And then, slowly, she stepped forward, her feet making no sound on the floor. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. She came closer, and the air grew colder, thicker, until it felt like it was closing in on me, suffocating me. Her face remained obscured, but I could feel her eyes cold, unblinking, boring into me. I didn't realize I had stepped back until my foot hit something hard. I turned, and my breath caught in my throat. The chest, now fully open, was empty. But there was something else there, something I hadn't seen before. A stone. It wasn't large, but it gleamed in the darkness, covered in strange symbols. I reached for it instinctively, as though it had been calling to me, just as the swamp had. The moment my fingers touched the surface, a shock ran through my body, electric, sharp, and I gasped, stumbling backward. The air shifted again, and suddenly, I wasn't alone. The mist had coalesced into shapes, human figures, faces twisted in silent screams. They weren't just shadows. They were people. People who had disappeared. People who had become part of the swamp. Lucille was standing at the edge of the room now, her hand outstretched toward me. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. Just a silent scream, as though she was trying to warn me, or maybe begging me to stay. I didn't know what to do. The swamp had taken everything: Thomas, Lucille, and now, perhaps, me. There was no escape. Not anymore. But as the figures closed in, as the weight of their souls pressed down on me, a thought flashed through my mind. What if this was only the beginning? The figures in the room pressed in closer, their faces contorted in silent agony, reaching for me with hands that seemed to melt into the shadows. Lucille's outstretched hand beckoned me toward her, and I knew, deep down, that she wasn't trying to help me. She was trying to pull me into the swamp, to become just another lost soul, another whisper on the wind. I grabbed the stone, its surface pulsing with a strange, otherworldly energy, and in a panic, I hurled it across the room. As it hit the floor, the room erupted in a violent, deafening sound like the very earth itself was cracking open. The figures howled in unison, and the shadows began to retreat, as if the stone had severed the connection between the house and the swamp. But Lucille's eyes, those cold, unblinking eyes, stayed with me, even as the room began to fade. The door behind me swung open, and I stumbled into the night, gasping for breath, as the house behind me collapsed into itself, disappearing into the fog of the swamp. I never returned to Manchuck Swamp. The whispers stopped. The dreams of Lucille of the shadows faded. But sometimes, on quiet nights, when the wind is just right, I can still hear them. And I know, deep down, the swamp is waiting for the next one. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.